I think we have to look to what the interests of the country and the party are, as opposed to Donald Trump. Donald Trump is pursuing his highest interest, which is Donald Trump. I think Republican leaders need to think of our bigger interest, which is the country and then the party.
Good afternoon. I'm Robert Costa with the Washington Post, a national political reporter. Today, here at Washington Post Live, we welcome back one of the more high-profile former members of President Trump's administration, now a high-profile critic who served as national security advisor to President Trump and previously served in other Republican administrations. Ambassador John Bolton, welcome back.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Ambassador Bolton, as you look at the landscape inside of the transition period during this lame duck period after the election, do you believe President Trump will take action against Iran?
No, I don't. I think the reports that he asked for options is fairly typical of the erratic, idiosyncratic, ill-informed, inconsistent way he makes decisions. The thought occurs to him that maybe it would be a good thing to do, and so he talks about it and then is talked out of it, or something else attracts his attention. I don't think that's at all likely. I think if anything, 30 days from now, he could be thinking about trying to meet with the Ayatollahs and make a deal to go back into the 2015 nuclear deal. That would be par for the course, I think, with him.
What are you hearing from inside?
Well, I think he is definitely not reconciled to having lost the election, that's for sure. I think he's being spun up by bad legal advice and bad political advice that maybe he does have a chance to win. I think in any event, he will never concede that he lost. He will say that the election was stolen from him. And I'm worried that in the next 9 weeks, he could still do a fair amount of damage, both to the country and the government and the Republican Party, all of which I think he's actively doing as we speak.
In your book, The Room Where It Happened, a White House Memoir, you write at length about Rudy Giuliani, the president's attorney, and the impeachment process, and your alarm about Mayor Giuliani's work with President Trump, his advice for President Trump. Now it's Mayor Giuliani leading the legal effort. What does that reveal? What do you know?
Well, I don't really know anything more about what I will loosely call their legal strategy than what you see unfolding in front of you. And I think we're really past time now. It's more than 2 weeks since the election. Everybody in the party's been very tolerant. Everybody says he has a right to pursue his legal remedies. I agree with that. But it's really at this stage beside the point. The issue is not, does he have a right to do all this? The question is it wise? Is it the best thing for the country? And despite one claim after another, including within the past 24 hours that evidence is coming out of a fire hose, there's still no evidence of massive fraud. So I think both for the sake of the country as a whole, to try and get past this very divisive election, and for the Republican Party, before large chunks of it come firmly to the erroneous belief that the election is stolen, we've got to begin to speak out and talk about what is going to happen on the 20th of January, which is a new president's going to be sworn in.
Do you believe it's time for President Trump to concede?
Sure, it's past time for him to concede, but he's not going to do that. I think we need to find ways to allow him to say the transition can begin without it becoming a concession that he's lost. I don't care whether he ever concedes, frankly, but I do think all of us as Republicans have an obligation to the country to ensure a smooth transition. I've been through good transitions and bad, and the incoming team can do well or do poorly depending on how they're treated. But if it's a bad transition, it's always bad for the country.
Do you believe the United States is vulnerable to attack or some other kind of disruption because the transition's not unfolding in the usual way?
No, I don't think we should be apocalyptic about it. I think it's a matter of degree. What you can say with certainty is that every day that goes by that the transition doesn't proceed in an orderly fashion leaves us more vulnerable. In 2000, and I speak as a veteran of the Florida recount, 37 days were lost with no real ability for the Bush team to interact with the government. And the 9/11 Commission said that might have been a factor in not being ready for the 9/11 attacks. No one can really know that. And I guess all I would say is, you want to take that chance again?
You know Chris Krebs, the recently fired director of cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency, pretty well. That firing by President Trump of Mr. Krebs was made on the heels of the termination of Mark Esper, the defense secretary. What's your reaction to the Krebs firing, and what does that tell us about where the president's going?
Well, I thought it was another bad mistake. There's absolutely no justification for it. There wasn't any justification to fire Mark Esper or the other top Defense Department officials. There wasn't any justification to fire Lisa Gordon Haggerty, the head of the National Nuclear Safety Administration, Security Administration. There wasn't any reason to fire Bonnie Glick, the Deputy Administrator of the Agency for International Development. There's no reason to decapitate your national security team with less than 10 weeks to go until the transition. That will inevitably cause disruptions in the agencies themselves, let alone their ability to hand off smoothly. And what I fear is, although there has been, I think, more negative Republican reaction on the Hill to Chris Krebs firing, that there's an enemies list in the White House of people still to fire, and that there's more to come.
Have you actually heard that there is an enemies list?
No, I'm worried that there's an enemies list. There probably is in Donald Trump's head. I doubt that he's written it out.
What does it say, though, about the Krebs firing in terms of the president's intent? You say you don't believe there was a reason for the termination, but what are we, as journalists, as American citizens, supposed to interpret here about the president's intent, his plan, when he fires all of these officials? What's he doing?
Well, there's no legitimate reason for it. I'm sure the reason he fired Chris Krebs was that Krebs said there was no evidence in cyberspace of fraud, election hacking, or other malfeasance, which is completely contrary to the fantasy world that the president lives in. That there's a conspiracy so vast and so successful that it's proceeding without leaving any evidence behind. And under that kind of theory, you can posit evil doing forever. And what the information that the Homeland Security Department, state and local officials have put out consistently, whether, by the way, they're Democrat or Republican, is that there's no evidence of any kind of fraud or malfeasance anywhere near the scale that would change the outcome of the election.
You've been in the room with President Trump. You've written about it. You've been sitting there in the Oval Office with him. You used the term fantasy world just now, Ambassador. Do you believe President Trump is operating in some sort of fantasy, some kind of reality that doesn't make sense? Or is he operating highly aware of what he's doing and with ill intent? How do you see that dynamic?
Well, I think he's operating the same way that he always did. In fact, if there's any silver lining in his behavior so far during the transition, and what I'm afraid we're going to see until January the 20th, is it will expose more to the American people the way he behaved on a day-to-day basis during his administration. And I think the more you see of this behavior, the more you're seeing the real man. I'm not saying he's detached from reality. I'm saying he likes to create his own reality and then get people to agree with it. When he runs into the real reality, sometimes that poses difficulty. And he's running into the real reality right now, having lost the election.
What's the reality in Afghanistan? The president is planning to order U.S. troops to be withdrawn to cut American forces in Afghanistan by roughly half, going from about 4,500 to 2,500. What's your response to that action?
Well, and the same decision with respect to Iraq. Neither one is justified by facts on the ground. In the case of Afghanistan, the withdrawal has nothing whatever to do with the so-called conditions-based withdrawal plan consistent with the administration's deal with the Taliban, a very ill-advised deal in my judgment. These numbers of 2,500 Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan have nothing to do with military necessity. They are entirely political numbers. It's a bad precedent. It sends a terrible signal. And this is not responsible behavior during the transition. It's hard to find exact precedents. I think the Somalia precedent of 1992, 1993 is pretty good. There's no question there's only one president at a time, but a responsible president who understands that the incoming president has to take over the situation on January the 20th, at least finds a way to try and make the transition smooth. And what Donald Trump is doing, and I think quite deliberately, is trying to make it as hard for Biden as he can, unnecessarily, potentially jeopardizing Americans on the ground in both countries and agitating the alliances with several of our allies that are already frayed enough.
Well, what does it actually mean in reality on the ground in Afghanistan for the Afghan security forces, for the fate of Kandahar, to have the U.S. troop levels go down to that level of about 2,500? How does that play out now in the coming months if that's all you have in terms of U.S. troops on the ground?
Well, I think it's a wholly insufficient number. It's a politically symbolic number. I'm still worried that what the president wants as a politically symbolic number is zero. And I don't rule out him trying to do that before January the 20th. The president agreed to a plan based on the deal with the Taliban. He's now changed his mind on that, which it's his right to do it. The question is, does it make sense from the perspective of American national interest and our long-term credibility around the world?
The acting Secretary of Defense, Christopher Miller, has appointed a retired Army colonel who you know, Douglas Macgregor, as his special assistant. Colonel Macgregor has been a critic of you. He has said publicly you have been supportive of Israel far too much, that you're a hawk. What's your response to Colonel Macgregor's comments about you personally?
Well, he's also said, I favor Israel because they've made me rich. And he said the same thing about Mike Pompeo and Lindsey Graham. Look, these comments are beneath contempt. They're blatantly anti-Semitic. And I just think it's a shock that somebody like Macgregor is on any government payroll, let alone the Defense Department.
You believe Colonel Macgregor is an anti-Semite?
I think his remarks are anti-Semitic. I definitely do.
And have you gotten any read about why he's been installed in that post and what he's up to with the new acting Secretary of Defense?
No, I really don't. I suspect his nomination to be ambassador to Germany, which was another travesty, wasn't going anywhere, and so he's been given to the Defense Department. But it's just another stain on the Trump administration.
Speaking of ambassadors to Germany, your former advisor at the UN, Rick Grenell, is now working with the president to contest some of these election results. Any response to Mr. Grenell, Ambassador Grenell, and his efforts? You know him well.
Well, look, I think the entire legal operation that the campaign has mounted has been seriously flawed, and obviously they didn't share their internal strategy with me. But from what I've been able to discern, there really was very little pre-election preparation for the kind of effort that they would have had to mount to have a ghost of a chance of being successful in alleging widespread fraud. There may have been attorneys selected or volunteered around the country for potential contests, but if, as the president said repeatedly during the campaign, they're going to try and steal it from me, it's rigged, and so on and so forth, attorneys and others should have been out there in the months before November 3rd looking for evidence, looking for areas of concern, perhaps bringing actions in court to prevent the fraud from actually happening. I don't see.
What about Ambassador Grinnell? With respect, Ambassador Bolton, are you unbothered by his conduct? Are you disappointed? Are you pleased with it in terms of how he's handling this election?
Well, I haven't honestly paid that much attention to what he's doing personally. To me, it's not a personal matter, whether it's Grinnell or Rudy Giuliani or whomever it might be. My point is that I think most of this is made up after the election. If they thought, for example, that Dominion voting systems was controlled by the Chinese communists, if they thought that, or by Maduro in Venezuela, I don't know what the latest theory is, or if they thought that Scorecard and Hammer were CIA computers and algorithms that had somehow gotten out of control. If they really thought all this before the election, why didn't we hear about it? Now, in the last 2 weeks, we have one theory after another. The only thing that's missing is actual evidence. And that is what ultimately will bring the entire strategy down, and I am afraid bring discredit to the larger Republican Party.
Do you believe this Trump legal team is going to try to push this to the Electoral College to disrupt it there, and then ultimately try to throw it to the U.S. House?
Well, I don't put anything past Trump. He doesn't think rules apply to him. I haven't seen any evidence of success so far. Rudy spent yesterday for 4 or 5 hours in court, mostly arguing about a claim that had been deleted from the complaint that they filed. He now wants to file a third complaint in that case. You know, you can only make this up as you go for so long before the courts you're appearing before and other courts that are watching get the point that there's no there.
What is Mayor Giuliani's legacy? You've known him going back to the 80s, your work in the Justice Department.
Well, look, I was friends with Rudy for many years, and a lot of bad things happened in the Trump administration, and I just think this is one part of it.
Any further thoughts, though, on him? I mean, you've known him for so long. To see him in federal court for the first time since the 1990s yesterday in front of the judge, you've read the reports about how it was quite a scene.
Yeah, look, I think the reports speak for themselves, and as I said, I don't really want to personalize this. My quarrel isn't with anybody working in the Trump administration. My quarrel's with Trump.
Would you encourage Krebs to speak out like you have?
Well, I think it's a very personal decision, and I can understand why some people have not spoken out. I wouldn't mind a little company, that's for sure. But this is very difficult. You had a lot of people who went into the administration because they wanted to serve the country. They thought they could make a contribution. Then they ran into the first president, I think, in our history who didn't fully appreciate the weight of his responsibilities, the gravity of the job. And they left under varying circumstances and for different reasons. Some of these people I've had my own disagreements with, but I've never doubted their patriotism or their devotion to the Constitution. I can't speak to what's on their mind about why they've spoken or not spoken, written or not written. Ultimately, more will come out, but it's everybody's got a lot of factors to weigh, and each will judge what's best for them.
While each judges what's best for them, are you disappointed by your longtime friend, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, for how he has handled President Trump's lashing out at the election result and refusal to concede?
Well, again, I just don't think talking about how particular individuals.
Well, I mean, he leads the Republican Party on Capitol Hill, and you keep calling on the Republican Party to speak out.
I understand that, and I've said it's a character test. I mean, I think I've been pretty direct about it. And I think it's important, especially, that Republicans speak up. We see polls now that something like 50% or more of self-identified Republicans think the election was stolen. This is manifestly not true. So we can collectively either not speak, not tell the truth, not explain what happened, in which case many in the party will only hear Donald Trump, and their views will harden. It will become more difficult to explain the truth. Do we wait and risk that, or do we begin to speak now? It's not a question of one person or another person. I think it's a question for all of us that have been in the Republican trenches for a long time, not to let the party be ruined because of the ego of one person.
Can we go back to the first question about Iran? Can you recall when you were in the White House about how President Trump spoke about possibly attacking Iran and its nuclear facilities at some point? How does he see it when he's talking to someone like his national security advisor? How does he talk about it?
Well, I wrote a 500-page book that explained a lot of bits and pieces about his decision making, and I tried very hard in that book not to reveal anything that was classified, and I think I succeeded, and I think the National Security Council reviewer agreed with that. If it weren't for the president's effort to stop the book from coming out entirely, we'd be in a different place. So I'm going to be a little bit careful here because the litigation continues. But I just don't think the president does this kind of analysis in a serious and responsible way. It's not that he is, if this report we've seen in the press about Iran is true, it's not because this is the consequence of a carefully thought out strategy for dealing with Iran, where objectives have been matched against resources and the conduct has been analyzed and cost-benefit analysis has been done, and he's concluded that a military strike might make some sense. It was just a thought that came to it, and probably has disappeared. As I say, may reappear next month with the idea that maybe he should fly to Tehran and meet with the Ayatollah Khamenei and cut a deal. It's perfectly possible. It's perfectly possible he'll say he wants to see Kim Jong-un again. That's the way he rolls, and it's important for people, whether you agree with decision A or decision B or decision C by Trump, that he doesn't think in philosophical or strategic or even policy terms. I describe in the book that his decisions are like an archipelago of dots. And in Washington, I know from what people have told me, it's hard for old Washington hands to believe that's true, but it is true.
Since the Biden team does not have access to high-level intelligence briefings or federal funds, they're scrambling to still have a transition process. I wonder, in the course of that effort, have they reached out to you, Ambassador Bolton, because you have recently been inside of this administration, you know the players. Has anyone from Biden's orbit reached out to you during the transition for advice or consultation?
No, they have not, and I don't expect it. And let me say, part of the problem here is that people are following the pattern of the 2000 transition, again, because of that Florida recount. The George W. Bush transition team was denied access. The president was getting some intelligence briefings, but the team itself really didn't have much contact with the government. I was in Florida. I don't know all the specifics, but I know that it was very disruptive. And that's not the approach we should be following now. The Presidential Transition Act needs to be rewritten. The idea that the administrator of GSA is supposed to make a decision in a context like this is completely misguided. The current incumbent is a subordinate of the president. She's not going to contradict him, at least not long enough to keep her job. There has to be a better way to do it. The better way, the easy, better way, is for a mature and responsible president to say, I don't agree that Biden's the president-elect, but just to keep things calm, I'm going to allow the transition preparations to begin. And we'll see when I win, we will have wasted money, but anyway, people will be happy. That Trump will not do that. So I think Biden is day by day being put in a more and more untenable position. And I might just say, this is another reason why Republicans who do think of the interests of the country first, and I really think that's where our party is, need to speak up more now.
I would like to ask a question from one of our audience members. Hasham Solomon from Wisconsin asked this question. Do you think President Trump is a security risk for the United States once he leaves office with foreign debt and knowledge of highly classified information? Ambassador Bolton?
Well, I don't know that he has foreign debt. Everybody seems to know more about Donald Trump's finances than I do. Maybe I just haven't been paying enough attention. Look, it's a concern I think that is legitimate to have. But honestly, there's enough to criticize in President Trump's conduct. You don't have to be apocalyptic about it. I just think everybody ought to take a deep breath. It's bad enough as it is. Don't let your imagination run wild just yet.
What do you think he does once he leaves office?
Well, I wish him a very quiet retirement at Mar-a-Lago. I hope he makes a lot of money in successful real estate investments. I'm worried that's not what's going to happen. I think he will try and keep his influence within the Republican Party. Maybe he'll buy a television network. God knows he'll continue to tweet. And I'm afraid it'll be very destructive for us.
Another question from our audience, Pat McPhears from Pennsylvania. Do you have any regrets, Ambassador Bolton, about your own choices in working for President Trump?
No, I thought that it was the right thing to do to try and go into the administration and do what I can. I thought America faced a substantial number of very serious national security challenges based on 8 years of mistaken policy in the Obama administration. I certainly wasn't shy in sharing my opinions. And I don't doubt I made a lot of mistakes. I wish I'd been more successful in persuading the president on a number of key issues. But knowing what I know now, I would still go in. I would probably do a lot of things differently. But I think it's important to serve the country if you have the opportunity. I'm sure that's what dozens, scores of other senior officials who have cycled through the 4 years of the Trump administration also believe, and I think their efforts should be commended and not criticized.
How do you believe the world and U.S. rivals or enemies even will challenge and test President-elect Biden once he takes office in January?
Well, I think there are a lot of ways in which that can happen, and I think they're certainly thinking about that right now. I believe that if you look at the strategic threats posed by Russia and China, there are any number of challenges they could pose. The continuing threat of nuclear proliferation by Iran and North Korea and others are very, very serious. And the continuing threat of radical Islamic terrorism remains and I think is growing. And I think sadly, because of the administration's deal with the Taliban in Afghanistan, are likely to grow worse in times ahead. So it's going to be a very challenging administration for President Biden. And just given his past views and the views of the Democratic Party, I think I'll have a lot to do in opposition for 4 years.
But do you believe he will be able to bolster relationships with U.S. allies that have grown beleaguered with President Trump?
Look, I think that's the wrong way to look at it. Donald Trump is an anomaly. Donald Trump is an aberration. Joe Biden represents conventional Democratic foreign policy thinking. So at least he will be a normal Democratic president. But as we've debated for many years now, I don't think even the normal Democratic worldview is the right one. So by removing the aberration and putting in I'm sure Biden would love being called the Warren Harding of 2020, but by putting in a normal, albeit Democratic president, I think you reverse the aberration. But the policies, the substantive policies, will remain, I think, in this country very much a matter of debate.
You've been in State Department circles, Justice Department circles, in government for decades. And when you saw the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, tell reporters a few weeks ago, that he's looking forward to a second Trump inauguration and a second Trump administration, even after the election was clearly moving in a different direction. What did you say to yourself? What does that tell you about Pompeo and the Trump administration at this critical juncture?
Yeah. Well, I said in response to earlier questions, I thought it was delusional. Look, Mike has made his bones with Donald Trump, and he's going to have to live with it.
We'll leave it there. Ambassador Bolton, appreciate your time this afternoon and coming back to Washington Post Live.
Well, thanks for having me.
And we appreciate you all coming by for another conversation here at Washington Post Live. We will keep having more of them in these exchanges with people who are critics of the administration and also working within the administration to give you a full picture of what's happening in the news, in the Democratic Party, in the Republican Party. And we, at 3 o'clock today, Karen Ataya will host Race in America, our ongoing series here at Washington Post Live, a discussion with the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, Opal Totiam, And tomorrow at 3 o'clock Eastern, I will interview Colorado Governor Jared Polis. That's Jared Polis tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern. Today we'll have Race in America with Karen Ataya from the editorial page. And on Monday, big event, big news here at Washington Post Live at 11:30 a.m. Eastern on Monday. Michelle Norris will host former President Barack Obama and the Mellon Foundation's president, Elizabeth Alexander, to discuss the president's new book, his just released memoir, A Promised Land. And then I'll be back at 1 o'clock Monday for a discussion with Dr. Anthony Fauci. So at Washington Post Live on Monday, President Obama and Dr. Fauci. So make sure to leave your late morning and afternoon free so you can join us for those conversations next week. And you can always find more information at WashingtonPostLive.com to register and get live streaming information about all of our upcoming programs. I'm Robert Costa, and we'll see you soon.